Let's just move on. I want to continue talking to you this morning about finding God and finding purpose in life. You know, the goal for us here in this church is for each one of us to find God, to connect to God in an ever-increasing and an ever-deep way, and also, as we find God, to find purpose in life, to know where we're going and why, both as individuals and as a congregation. Last week we said that to find out where we're going, it helps to line up the significant events in the past. And so you can look at those times where you've connected with God or where God has opened doors for you in the past, and that will help you to see where you need to go in the future. And we looked at some of the significant events last week of the history of our church. We also said last week that to find God and to find purpose, for us we need to stop looking in the wrong direction. That is, we need to stop looking for things that long-term don't produce life in our life. And number two, we need to start to look in the right direction. And of course, the right direction is for us to seek Jesus. You know, when we give our life to Jesus Christ, it's not a one-time thing and then you're done. We need to give our life to Jesus like that song we sang this morning said, I surrender all. You know, that's a daily occurrence thing, or it should be for us. And every day we should be seeking Jesus, seeking Him on a more intimate level. In John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So if we want to find life, we find it through Jesus. You know, your enthusiasm this morning is really catching. Jesus said in John 7:37, He says, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. So we find life and we find purpose in life when we find Jesus. Let's continue on our journey this morning. David said in Psalms 63:3, he says, your loving kindness is better than life. You see, the fact is, if we seek Jesus with all of our hearts, if we surrender to Him on a daily basis, we will find that God's loving kindness is better than life. I think it's also interesting to note that the psalmist David didn't write this when he was seated on his throne and when he had 1,000 people there just to manicure his toenails or to do whatever. But when he was, he didn't write that God's loving kindness is better than life. He didn't write that when everything was going well for him. In fact, he wrote this before he was a king. He wrote this when he was in the desert, and he was with men who were in debt, distressed, and discontented. 400 of these guys. Can you imagine? How many of you have ever gone to Calgary with your family? Please don't respond to this question. How many of you have gone to Calgary or to Edmonton with your family and your kids are all grumpy and you're grumpy and nothing seems to be the way it should be? You ever had a trip like that? I told you not to respond. I remember once I took a group of people to Calgary, and I thought we could just go to Calgary and hang out and have a good time. Oh my goodness, I learned that you have to have a plan and you have to have a purpose. Otherwise, it's not a fun time. You know, can you imagine though, David was with 400 of these guys and their families. And he wrote, maybe that's why he learned to connect to God on a deeper level, but he wrote, your loving kindness is better than life. You see, David knew God's love, His loving kindness, that is His mercy, His faithfulness, His fidelity, His loyal love was more important than life itself. In fact, David would have traded his life for God's loving kindness. For David, the relationship that he had with God was all important, and he would not have traded that for anything else in life. You know, sometimes people say, I would believe in God if, and then they talk about some amazing miracle, if that would happen, that they would believe in God. And you know what? They wouldn't. They wouldn't. In John 10:24 and 25, the religious leaders were skeptical about Jesus, and so they came to him. And in verse 24 it says, so the Jews gathered around him and said to him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Jesus answered them, I told you, and you did not believe. You see, the fact is that if we are determined not to believe, there isn't anything that can happen that will convince us to believe. You know, you might say this morning, you might say that if God lifted the roof off of the sanctuary, put it 100 feet in the air, wrote on the wall, I am God and I am real and I love you as a person, and then put a cashier's check for $1 billion in your hand, you would say, then I would believe. Reality is, if you were convinced not to believe, not even that would convince you. You would say, well, there just happened to be a tornado on just this one spot that lifted the ceiling up. And then the wind caught a felt pen and made some scribbles on the wall. And then also the wind found this cashier's check somewhere and put it in my hand. You see, if you're determined not to believe in life, there isn't anything that will convince you, that will make you believe. You know, sometimes we think if only God, I actually went to an atheist website to look and some of the different things that they said would have to take place before they would believe in God. But even if those things happened, they still would not believe in God. They still would rationalize the events that happened, and they would not be convinced. You know, sometimes we think that we'll trust God if such and such an event would happen. If you're not convinced, if your eyes aren't open to seeing, if your ears aren't open to hearing, if your heart is hard, there isn't anything that God can do that would make you respond to Him. If you're skeptical, you will remain skeptical. If you came to church this morning and you think I'm an idiot and you don't think that I have anything intelligent to say, I'm being real. You're not going to be able to receive from me. We have to put ourselves in a place where we are open to hearing God's voice. You know, the fact of the matter is, we can know God. You know, sometimes we talk today about taking a leap of faith, and it's just as if we're just supposed to believe in something that isn't really possible. Like our belief in God is just some wild leap somewhere that we just decide to do. You know what? We don't have to take a leap of faith like that. We need to believe in God and we need to be open to hearing from Him, but we're not taking any wild imaginary leaps this morning. The fact of the matter is, we can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. That brings me to my first point. I know there is a God because science points to the fact that there is a creator. You know, today in society with social media, people make rash statements, and then other people jump on the bandwagon. They take the rash statement as if it's true. Be careful what you believe today. You know, I just read a book, and part of it talked about a noted scientist who said, the more I study science, the more I know that there is not a God. What do the two statements have to do with each other? Nothing. The guy may be a scientist and he may know all about science, but that does not prove that there isn't a God. The more he studies science, come on. You know, I could say as a pastor, the more I look out as a pastor, the more I look out my window, the more I've determined that the world is flat. Come on. Guy who says he's a scientist and says that because he's a scientist and he studies science, he knows that there isn't a God. Those two statements don't have anything to do with each other. We need to not be gullible. You know, a more accurate statement is, the more I understand science, the more I know there is a God. You know, I'm not a scientist, and so I don't pretend that I'm going to make all of the good, rational arguments to you this morning. But I read a book by Dallas Willard called Knowing Christ Today, and the book is about how we can know. We don't have to take some leap of faith, but we can know that there is a God. And in his book about knowing God, he says that Albert Einstein found that matter is created by energy. And he says in the book that God is energy. And so God, who is energy, when he spoke, the universe was created. God, who is spiritual, spoke, and the world, the universe that we know today, was created. You know, as I was reading this book, it just made so much sense to me. And like I said, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not trying to get into all of the arguments with you. Find the book yourself and read it. And he takes you through the step-by-step thing to prove that there is a God who created the universe. You know, he talks in the book about how things need to have a beginning. Stuff doesn't just happen. There's a beginning to something. If you have a whole row of dominoes across the front of the stage here, and you have them all set up, and I'm not wandering around and stamping on the stage, something has to happen before all of those dominoes will tip over. There has to be a starting point. You don't get something from nothing. There has to be a beginning point. And he used that was only part of his arguments to prove that there is a God. Our problem is today is people are bound and determined to believe that there is not a God, and then they look for answers for creation. They look for answers inside of what is created, rather than knowing that the person who created, that God who created, is outside of what he's created here, because God is spiritual. And God, who is spiritual, who is all-powerful, who has energy, he speaks and matter is created. That we have what we have here today. We can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. There is a God who is real. There is a God who loves us. The second point I have this morning, we can know not only there is a God, but that I can know that God is a creator who loves us or who loves me. Take it personally. God, who is loving, proved this by sending his own Son into the world, and he did this while we had our backs turned on him. You know, it's easy if somebody's being nice to you all the time. It's a lot easier to love them then, isn't it? But if somebody's spitting in your face, if somebody's not being nice to you, I'll sum up my thoughts there. if somebody's not being nice to you, is being really ignorant with you, it's a lot harder to love them. And yet that's exactly where all of us were. While we were not being nice, while we were sinful beings, God sent His Son into the world for us so that we could have a relationship with Him. To get back to David, let me read Romans 5:8 first. It says, Christ died for us while we were still sinners. This demonstrates God's love for us. David said that this God and His loving kindness was better than life itself. It was worth more than his life, and he knew and he trusted in God's love for him. He knew God's love. Wasn't just he thought that God loved him, wasn't just that he perceived that God might love him. David knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. He knew that God loved him. You know, his life showed it. His actions showed it. You know, there's a number of different things that he did in life. He never killed King Saul when he had the opportunity. King Saul was chasing him and was running after him and trying to kill him. And David had King Saul at least twice firmly within his grasp, and he refused to kill Saul. Why did he do that? Because he knew God's loving kindness would one day take care of Saul for him. And he was not going to do anything to take care of Saul himself. You know, there's a couple of different times. Let me just talk about them very briefly. The first time was when David is hiding in a cave with his 400 men. Saul has his army. I think Scripture talks about Saul has 3,000 of his best men, and they're chasing David. David hides in a cave. Must have been a huge cave, eh? Hides in the cave, and Saul, let me just be crude for a little bit, Saul comes in to go to the bathroom. And while he's squatting there, David's men try to convince David, okay, God has placed him in your hand, now you can kill him. And David said, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, what he did was he cut off a piece of Saul's robe as Saul is squatting there. And he let Saul go. And then another time, there was something like that happened, only this time it was when David and one of his best men, they went into Saul's camp. The camp was all asleep. Went into the camp and took Saul's spear and his water jug that were laying right beside Saul. And David's man said, let me strike him dead. And David said, no, I absolutely won't do that. You see, David trusted in God's loving kindness. There's another time too. Where David trusted in God's loving kindness. And to be honest, this kind of boggles my mind, this last story. It's when David has messed up. David has done something that is really wrong. And what he's done is he's ordered his main general to number the fighting men in the nation of Israel. And David is not supposed to do that because nobody's supposed to number the fighting men. And God made that as a law so that the people would trust him, not trust in the size of their army. And here is David. People think that he was a little proud and he was, he's sitting on his throne and things are going very well for him. So then he decides, I'm going to count the soldiers in the children of Israel. And reluctantly, his star general went out to do that. And then a prophet comes to David and says, not a good thing to do. And he gave David 3 alternatives. The first one was, as punishment for what David had done, to convince David that this wasn't a good thing to do, he gave David 3 different choices. The first one was that he could suffer 3 years of famine. The second one was that he could spend 3 months running from his enemies. Or that the third one was that he could suffer 3 days of plague in the land at the hand of God. And he chose the 3 days of plague. He said, "Let me fall into the hands of God because I know he's merciful." Which one of those would have you chose? David put himself directly into the hands of God because he knew that God was merciful. And you know, if you follow the story through, that's exactly what happened. A plague started to come, but long before the 3 days were up, God stayed his hand and said, "That's enough." David knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was loving, and David trusted in God's loving kindness. And you know, you might be here this morning and you might think, yeah, but that's David. And I know God doesn't treat me this way. But you know, in Romans 2, verse 11, it says God shows no partiality. He shows no partiality. In Matthew 5:45, Jesus said, he makes his sun rise on people, whether they are evil or good. He lets rain fall on them, whether they are just or unjust. God isn't partial to certain people. Let me throw in for free, though, you know what does motivate God is not because he loves one person more than another, but what does motivate God is faith. Jesus said, if we have faith as small as a grain of mustard seed, we shall say to a mountain, move into the sea, and it'll be done. So faith motivates God, but God doesn't choose one person over another. God doesn't choose me over you, and God doesn't choose you over me. Isn't that cool? Another way I know that God is a loving creator is because, my third point, he gives me love for other people. In Romans 5:5, it says, God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. In 2 Timothy 1:7, it says, for God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and of love and self-control. You know, the fact of the matter is sometimes people just aren't that lovable. Of course, none of you in this church fall into that category. Maybe there's a few people in other churches in town that might fall into that category, but I know it's none of us, right? But you know, God gives us love for others. He puts his love in our heart so that we can respond to him and so that we can respond to each other. Let's apply these principles to us in the church here. You know, this is one of the cultures of our church, is that we love others and we accept others where they're at. I don't know how many of you remember Josh Scandrup, but Josh was a guy of about 25 years old, and he was wise beyond his years. I knew him as a kid, and he was raised by godly parents, and Josh was just a wise man. And I saw how Josh could, when we're having a Bible study, how Josh could take a person who has a point of view over here, and he could take a person who has a point of view over there, and he could bring them together, and so that they would stop arguing about who was right. Because probably they were both right, they were just arguing different sides of the same issue. Josh was a very wise man, so we put him on the board. And I remember when Josh first came on the board, he actually got on my nerves a little bit. I know you guys find that hard to believe. But I'd come up with this great and wonderful idea about what we should do at the church. There's only about 30 or 40 people in the church at the time. I'd come up with this great and wonderful idea. That's sarcasm, by the way, if you don't catch that. I would have this amazing idea, and Josh would ask me in the board meeting, why do you want to do that? Because I want to. But I came to realize that Josh's why was not because he was opposing what I was doing. Josh's why didn't have anything to do. Josh was trying to understand where I was coming from so that he could take my ideas and make them better and make them more applicable to what we were doing here. And that was really, when I saw Josh's heart in that, I really got to appreciate Josh, and Josh became one of my closest advisors. In fact, when I would be doing a new sermon series, before I would start out the sermon series, I would phone Josh, and his job allowed him to come spend a few hours, and him and I would go over the sermon series and decide where we wanted to go when. Josh had a really good mind. He could do that sort of stuff. You see, one of our cultures, I don't know if you can say that, one of the things that we stand for in our church here is that we love other people. But to really love other people, God has to do a work in our heart to start with. And then we need to see things from other people's point of view. I needed to see that Josh, with the personality that God had given him, I needed to see that he wasn't opposing me. Actually, he was on my side, and he wanted to help me make the ideas better. And God has given each one of us different gifts, and God has given us different talents, and God has given us different abilities. And we need to recognize that just because people see things differently than other people doesn't mean that we should write them off or not have anything to do with them. God has poured his love into our heart, and so one of the cultures of our church is that we love other people, and we learn to accept other people where they're at, and we don't try to change everybody to be like us, because God has made each one of us as an individual, and so we need to learn to love and appreciate other people the way they are. Remember what I said a few weeks ago, God didn't make any mistakes when he made us. And yeah, each of us need to grow. I need to grow. But it's a culture in our church. A number of years ago, it was about this same time when I got to appreciate Josh. Joyce and I went away to Radium and spent a week because we wanted to come up with a vision for our church. We'd read the book Simple Church. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but we read the book Simple Church at the time, and it meant so much to it. It wasn't one of these books, oh wow, that book's really cool, I want to copy and do what that book is saying. I don't do that, or I try not to do that. But I read the book, and it was like, yes, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. This makes sense for us, for a congregation. And so I read that book, and then Joyce and I went away to Radium for a week to try to put it in writing, to put it down so it made sense, so that the church could catch it. And you know what we actually did? We had Josh come up with a presentation for the church. And that was the beginning of our love God, love others, and serve. I've got the original PowerPoint that Josh made. Can we just, this is Josh's thing. Discipleship is our purpose. This is, how long ago was that? Oh man, it must be 6, 7 years ago. But this changed our church. Next slide. You see, the process is we need to get people to love God, to love others, and to serve. Next slide. Sunday morning is going to be about loving God. Wednesday night is going to be about small groups. And out of those two things, we want people to start to serve. Next slide. Next slide. Loving God, that's what I said before. Sunday's the focus. The second slide is loving others. You know, we said numerous times that you can't love people by just seeing them at their best when they're hanging out in church for a few minutes after the service, drinking a coffee. You need to, if you're going to love other people, you need to be with them. You need to spend some time with them, and you need to learn the stuff about them that bothers you, and then you need to get over it and love them anyways. This is who we want to be as a congregation. Next slide. And then out of that, we want people to not live selfishly, but to serve. About the time that we were doing this, if I understand it right, Crossroads, the biggest church in town, an amazing, good church, by the way, Crossroads had built a slide to take their children from one level down to the next level. I've never seen it, but that was the story I heard, and, you know, that's cool. And I was talking to Josh, and he says, well, we can never compete with that. But he said, one thing that we can compete with is relationships. And so that was the beginning of us deciding that we were going to build this church on relationships, that we were going to build this church on fellowship with each other. And you know, are we perfect in that? No, absolutely not. But that's our goal. That's what our aim is. And if you're here this morning and you don't think you fit in any place, I want you to know that you fit in here. You might be here and you might think, well, I'm a little different. And I say, so, aren't we all? But we want our church to be built on loving God, where each one of us grow closer to God, and where we learn to overlook the issues in our lives, and where we, out of a heart of loving God and loving others, we're willing to live unselfishly, we're willing to serve. You know, that's simply who we are about as a church. And we can know God. We don't have to just have some ideas about Him. We can know God. And God promises us that if we seek after Him, we will find Him. And I submit to you this morning, if you seek after Him, you will also be able to understand what your purpose is. I'll talk more about that next week. But so many people question, what is my purpose in life? And you know what your purpose is? Is to love God and to love others and to serve. You know, I really thank the guys who did so much work on the stage. You know, to be honest, I felt guilty because you guys are here doing it and I'm not. But I don't need to be here all the time. In fact, reality is if I was here, I'd probably just get in the way. because I'd be probably trying to tell them, hey, this isn't how you should build it. You should build it this other way. And you know, the older I get, the more I know that I have far more wisdom than young guys. But I also understand that a lot of times I just need to step out of the way and let other people do what God has called them to do and to trust others. And I mean, that doesn't mean that I don't have a place. But you know, each of us have a place. Each of us. You know, some of us like to have close personal connections with other people. Some of us like to have close personal connections with other people from afar. God's made us all different. God has made us all different, but I want this church to be a place where we can know God and we can find purpose.